I'll ask someone to check. Straight live out here. Sir, thank you. It's not happening. Hello. Waiting for Tech Tuesday. Just subscribe to this one. I must be. Technical glitch is technical glitch. Yeah, it's coming. It's waiting for Tech Tuesday. Camera, can you just go and send us the camera once?
So what's the name of the company? Okay. Right, so they've seen the potential. No, what you've got to do really go across the whole space. You will sustainability.
Also, the ESG access so any consulting frameworks and all these, then we partner. What's your interest in technology? Just as a tool. No. Exactly. Just be almost like a spot on. So what sorts of it's a coordinate transaction. It's just in general, it's not like
Exactly.
So it's almost like one of the stolen
Okay.
Good luck.
Yeah, sure.
Much better working.
Hello. Can I request everyone to please take your seats? Good evening, everybody, and thanks to each one of you for making it today in spite of the train strike. I really mean it. I know it's quite a few people have come from outside London, and I know it kind of takes a lot for them to come down and attend this event. So thank you once again. My warm welcome to all the esteemed panel members for this evening and to all the guests present here for the 10th episode of Tech Tuesdays. For some of you who are attending the event for the first time, Tech Tuesdays UK stemmed from the very idea of building a community that ideates, nurtures, and then fosters a free-flow discussion of disruptive technologies, which have the potential to impact 1 billion lives. As most of you would know, Tech Tuesdays UK is a monthly event, which takes place on the first Tuesday of every month at the same very place, where we spend an hour and a half having conversations around technology. The most unique thing about Tech Tuesdays UK, which some of you realize as you go through the event, that this is a free-flow discussion where we do not have any given script or any given questions on any particular format as such. Moving on, this event would not have been possible without the active support of our partner, KLM Gets, who are sponsoring this event for the last 10 months and continue to help us as we go forward. We obviously are not a marketing budget-driven company, so therefore we request each one of you to support us, spread the good word around. During the event, as well as after the event, our Twitter handle, which is X now, is techtuesdaysUK. You can see out there. And on LinkedIn, please use the hashtag techtuesdaysUK to promote us. You can also catch up on the previous episode of Tech Tuesday, which you can find on YouTube. Last but not the least, we've also created a video by station, wherein we will invite some of you to share your thoughts on Tech Tuesdays UK. Your comments are highly appreciated, and for records, they will be shared across all our digital touchpoints. So kindly ensure that you hang around during the networking and training session. That reminds me one more thing, given that it's train strike today, we'll try in all earnest to wrap up the core session by 8 p.m. today. Okay. If you have any questions, please keep them ready and be very, very specific in terms of what you want to ask. With regards to today's episode now, as you'd be aware, every episode of Tech Tuesdays UK is based on a particular technology theme. And the theme for this evening is digital identity. And to drive the discussion today, we have an amazing panel with us. Let me take the pleasure of inviting them and request them to take their seats. Can I have a round of applause, please? We have Helen Pitt. She's the Identity and Data Director at GSMA. We have Mike Short, who's the chair of UK Telecom's Innovation Network and the former chief scientific advisor. In fact, Mike was the person who was part of our launch event in January. Mike, good to have you back. And last but not the least, we have Kieran Dalton. Kieran is the chief product officer at Secura. With that, I leave the floor to you guys. It's all yours now.
I normally go for ladies first, but I'm happy to go first if you
So I come here from GSMA, where we've got all the mobile operators and the wider mobile industry working together. And my focus is on how what data is in the network can be used to control systems. So I can provide online, and these systems can know that they're dealing with someone. And this is essentially to help access to digital services. Realizing there's a lot of issues with all the services we try to connect with online, whether fraud or
So I used to be chief scientist in the UK government, and I'd rather not talk too much about the government tonight, if you don't mind. But I did also act as chairman of the GSM Association some 27 years ago. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit more generically about why identity is important and what we can do with it. And then say a little bit more about the why and the what before the how, because I think my experts on the left are more expert in the how than I am.
Scientist, in, inventor of everything, etc. So I've had an interesting past in the last 10 years or so. So I used to work for a startup up in the north of England. I assume you probably been to the north of England, because why would you? But we came up with the concept of leveraging mobile operators as a mechanism to kind of verify individuals. You verify the numbers not being compromised. So it's probably 10 years or so ago, pre-GDPR, it was almost kind of like an open goal in terms of being able to access data and determine compromise and everything. Now, if you fast forward 10 years, I'm now in a position where I was in the GSMA for a year or so. So I got the view of that global perspective of how the mobile operator could be using the verifying identity. I went to BT around the corner, so I got the view of the telco side of it, and the BMF and the red tape and the various other things that can restrict it. But now at Secura, I taking that concept, that idea of leveraging this kind of 7 billion plus mobile devices that's connected already, is something that we're very much kind of focused on. So in particular, all the good work that GSMA does in terms of frameworks and things like that, I'm on the practical side of it. So it's how do we do it, what data can we access, what data can we access, how can we influence things, which is now led. I think we've got coverage of about 2.5 billion, and recently gone live in India and places like that. So some really fascinating stories of how we're able.
Can I go back in time? Do you mind if I go back in time a little bit? Because I think it's quite important to understand the heritage. Some of the credit checking before you could actually have a mobile phone was inappropriate back in the 1980s. For example, it used to take in some countries up to a month so you could get a subscription to a mobile phone. I remember when the German operator Deutsche Telekom came to the UK to say, how quickly are you connecting customers? And I said, well, we've just got the credit checking down very, very low to a very tiny amount of time. So, well, we've got it down to a month. And he was very proud that it only took a month in Germany in 1989 to be able to connect a mobile phone. They just didn't have a sense of service or didn't have a sense of how important identity management was. We'd actually just got it down from a week to less than an hour back in 1989. We'd also made sure that we had mechanisms between the mobile operators where we could understand if fraud was going on. So things like Experian credit checking mechanisms also came to the fore. So lots of mechanisms were built in the early 80s or late 80s to make sure we could connect. But it actually defined whether you had a post-pay market or a prepaid billing market. And that was quite important. If you couldn't do credit checking, prepaid had to step in. We didn't really have prepaid in the early years at all. It was high revenue per customer, mainly post-pay and then prepay. But actually, even when you got into things like prepay, you had to do some market segmentation. So digital identity became absolutely critical to grow the market. It wasn't just to minimize crime. It wasn't just to make sure bills were paid. It was to help segment the market. So there were lots of clever techniques introduced in the late 1980s and early 90s to do market segmentation. But I think digital identity today is much more significant because we expect to be able to pay for things, know where things come from, understand the provenance, which is another form of identity. We need to understand that the goods are being delivered to the right address. We need to make sure that the right SIM card is in the right device. There are all sorts of issues today. So one key reason why identity management is important now is minimizing crime, but also maximizing market impact. I'll go through a few other reasons later if you like.
Right, so I apologise because I have the tendency of just rambling and going off in different directions, so please kick me. But I just want to touch on that idea of segmentation and demographics. So if you think of, again, I'm going to bring it back to what I do on a daily basis. So we effectively present insights that will be via a partner or to a bank or whoever to kind of determine, can we onboard them or can we take them through maybe a more rigorous KYC process, etc., etc. What I'm finding really fascinating is the differences we're seeing market by market. So, and actually sector by sector. So geography and sector will be slightly different. So in one sense, I use an example, working with a subprime lender, shall we call them, who were looking at ways of validating individuals without any form of friction and kind of reducing all of this kind of heavy paperwork, etc. Now, the assumption, and this is the bit I was getting to in terms of this prepay, postpay, the assumption was, well, these will be people who maybe have low-value devices who it's all prepay on certain networks, etc., etc. It just wasn't. So for us, it was a win, because actually one of the biggest challenges we've got is if you have that prepaid market where, you know, effectively you can get a SIM card and register as Mickey Mouse and the checks and balances aren't really there in the UK. For us, it was hugely important to have, well, actually post-pay, but still being able to determine risk, credit, various other things based on a mobile phone number was actually a huge positive. And then just as another example, just super quick, sure. We've been doing some stuff in South Africa, and it's really interesting because they've got this concept of load shedding and resource issues, etc. But the whole of the country relies on mobile. What's happening actually though is that the predetermined thinking was it was feature phones and not smartphones. It was, you know, everyone's attached to the phone because there's no infrastructure. But it's not. It's actually smartphone penetration, I think, is now over 80%. And actually, people are switching the phones up more and more, potentially because of the load shedding and the lack of resource and the ability to charge. We don't know, but it's kind of fascinating to then see, well, are we seeing a different behaviour with kind of how we operate kind of digitally? And that association with the mobile, and again, it was just because you mentioned the demographic, but we've made lots of assumptions, and actually the customers we work with make lots of assumptions, and it's amazing how wrong they are.
I wanted to react to the example you took, because I thought, well, in fact, it's still in the same place. It's not a month to do a credit check, but the challenge is always the same thing. How do you onboard that quickly without too much fraud? So it's always the same. It's like you know your fraud and your user experience. I think you can probably dig a bit deeper as well in that, because when we look at when people struggle to onboard, so they don't have the right data to check. So it could be that they're just other than their low income, they could also be coming from another country, they prefer in the UK, and they haven't got yet. So that's where we look at mobile as another source of data that can help with onboarding. But then there's also the usability challenge. I think it's not just it has to be one thing super smooth, but some of the processes that people are putting in place to tick all the boxes are going to be quite cumbersome, require education. Not everyone's going to have that the device or the education to go through something where I scan my passport or something, I've got one, and then I go through the whole process. So can we do things again that are low friction in the background? And for me, this is where we're really playing. We're looking at mobile intelligence as this other source of data that's help broaden the number of people you bring on board with digital services and make it more easily. But the issues they're the same. you get onto digital services easily. So your first layer, you get the connectivity, and then people need that identity layer. And that's what everyone's trying to solve.
Okay, just touch on the friction point. Again, it's probably another finding. It's something that I'm really keen on is actually you do. It's you do something and you go, okay, well, the assumption is wrong, and you have empirical data, etc. So if you look at some of the services using the mobile data, in things like authenticating, so remove this concept of SMSOTPs and etc. And so there are deployments now with banks like NatWest and Barclays, the US, the number of banks who use it, but fundamentally using the network to do the same thing as an SMSOTP. Now, what I find really fascinating is that can be done in like a fraction of a second. No friction, no interaction, no nothing. But you can't do that. You can't because that lack of friction suggests a lack of security and a lack of confidence in this actually anything happening. So everybody is deployed in the same way, where they'll either have a little, spinning whatever, or something that comes up going, we are checking your mobile at this point, and artificially lengthening that process to, so we've always talked about that friction and security, but like it's actually a requirement a lot of the time, because apart from, I would say, some of the younger demographic, which incidentally is now a complete open goal in terms of fraud, but yeah, it's just. Yeah.
Like the circle and waiting for 2-3 seconds, your data has been checked. We want that as a user. I'm being told, go find my passport, scan it, the data's not right, sorry, put it in your friend, and I spent 5 minutes switching around it. Lost me. We've moved away from the wild way.
No, I've got a few more ways, but what do you do with shared devices? How do you identify the person who should pay when a device is shared? You can look at that from a different point of view, from an identity point of view, and say, well, it doesn't matter if they've agreed collectively to share, as long as there's a bill payer. So you need to identify the bill payer if sharing is going to be. But that does raise some questions about who you're communicating with, if you're receiving a call or not.
And actually, there's a wider topic around that exact same theme in terms of, we have the ability today to look at a number and the ownership of the number. So you could turn around and maybe leverage that then for things like age verification and say, well, this number has an associated user who is over 18. But the problem is if they're on a family plan and the child underneath is on that plan, it starts getting really kind of cumbersome. So yeah, I think we always say it's a piece of the jigsaw and not the whole answer, but then I think there's an element as well where there's an extra level of kind of intelligence where behavior comes in and things like that, where you can, this number is associated to typically doing these types of payments. If something looks different, it's normally that triggers the question marks.
It also raises questions about advertising. How do you fit advertising to a group who are using that shared phone? If you can't identify an individual, are you advertising to a group and then therefore cutting out a lot of the advertising or subsidy that may be relevant in that area?
No, I was just going to say, I feel like we're at a very early stage in a way where mobile operators are focused on getting a few products to market which are focused on fraud prevention primarily, not looking at advertising, because there's also a level of what are you doing with my data? It's my data. It needs to be really justifiable. That's not the business of the operator to do and use the data and to connect to it. So, but if they're protecting you from fraud, it's probably going to be an easier case to make. And so they focus on these use cases that are about fraud prevention, and maybe not where the data, as you say, could be a challenge. Is it me or is it someone else in my family? But there are certain very unique data points in the networks, and these are probably more valuable because nobody else can have them. Whereas arguably other people can detect my email address. And I think the fraud signals from the fact that I'm using the phone and the phone number still on that SIM card, and all of these little signals that could indicate to the bank that something that shouldn't be happening is happening. Sharing that data and helping to increase the fraud, that's very much what that's the focus.
Yeah, I say the advertising as well. It's interesting, the identity piece of that. It was somebody around here, and for the life of me, I don't know the advertising world, but I somehow ended up speaking to somebody who was in one of the big players, and they were explaining at the time, which was probably only 2-3 years ago, that because of things like incognito mode and you've got DuckDuckGo and various other things, even just it's almost kind of two levels, isn't there? There's one level of, well, you could end up advertising to a minor something that you don't want to advertise, but then the other level is this huge amount of revenue that's reliant on certain technologies that unfortunately now, because privacy and various other things are coming in, you just fundamentally just doesn't work. So I was explaining the kinds of things that we were doing, and he was saying that if we could have put something, like if there was something there, I mean, I don't know the industry at all, so I could, I could tell him what was available and things, but he was saying that there's a missing piece, that identity piece, because they'll spend like £25 to target the right individual with a Land Rover advertisement. Well, if that's not, to your point, if that's the child of an account remotely, I mean, it's just wasted money, isn't it? So,
can I ask a couple of more questions then? Who pays for identity? If we think about mobile, identity is designed in to actually make sure you connect to the right person. But who pays for identity? Some people might pay for it because it helps with credit checking and authorization. Some might identify identity as part of a service, such as advertising or promotion. But there are also some cases where identity is absolutely critical by geography. Things need to be delivered to the right geography, but also you might see patterns of geography, and identity management by geography is key. Some of the work I do in satellites is observing the Earth from above, where geography is even more critical. Can we identify, for example, flooding in rivers? Can we identify coastal erosion? Can we identify deforestation? In mobile, we can do a lot of things as well, particularly identifying the geography that is relevant to a service opportunity or to a threat. How do we identify who pays for identity? Do we just assume it's there, or do we declare it?
It's quite a narrow lens, by the way, what I'm going to say, but if I look at it from a commercial standpoint, most of the deployments of where you could loosely associate it to identity is all down to fraudulence. So it's understanding whether an individual or somebody else has done something to somebody's account, for example. Where it's getting really complex is right now with things like authorized push payment fraud, where it's actually the identity is correct. They're making a payment on the right device, the number, their account, they've logged in, etc., etc., etc. But it's somebody else that's coercing them and socially engineering them to do it. So then that whole realm of identity gets very kind of muddled. But with my commercial bully hat on, sort of like if I look at it and think, it's quite fascinating that I know tier 1 banks that use these services and said we have managed to get an uplift of 25% registrations, or gambling companies have said we've managed to acquire more customers and things like that. But it's never the driver; it's always that fraud loss, and that's the thing that's paying for it. It's the regulation that's wrapped around the fraud loss, basically, and who's kind of holding the purse strings.
One second, just 1 second. Just introduce yourself again.
Hello, I'm Anurag Chaudhary. A very basic dumb question. Who owns the identity? You pay for getting the identity check or something. Whose data is that? Is it mine or is it someone else? And why is somebody sharing my data in the first place? I think that is where I'm completely lost. You're going, once the data is shareable, or you check it, do it, etc., etc. So that's fair. But if it's my data and I don't want it to share, you shouldn't be doing anything about it.
So just to clarify, at no point are we sharing any PII.
I mean, checking like.
I know, I understand.
That's my question.
I just want to clarify that there's not a honeypot of information about you that we're passing around. But I think what's interesting, I think David Birch says this, but I might be wrong, so I apologize. But it's like it's our data, it's our individual's data, but then the idea of control of your own data, would you want most of the UK public to be in control of what they do with their own kind of persona and data and attributes? Because I don't think I would. So it's almost like that framework of not sharing anything sensitive, doing it in a certain way that obfuscates anything from being sensitive, but in a way that will influence things is kind of.
Again, I think it comes back to what you're trying to do. So if someone's posing as me and saying, putting it as Karen, saying, I'm Karen, and I'd be quite happy that someone has taken steps to share a food signal, and it's not they're not sharing personal data about me, but they're sharing a signal that alerts the bank that maybe you shouldn't trust this person, and you should have some security step in the process. That makes it a little bit more difficult. Then there's something that doesn't look right. But for other cases, I think it was in the Czech Republic, where all the operators worked together to create an alternative sort of scoring mechanism for credit scoring. They had all this data. There was a lot of people that were unbanked, and they created this score. But it wasn't done behind the customer asked, do you want us to use your mobile data to provide a credit scoring? That may improve your chances, because there was this data for people that were unbound. Then it's completely very compounded, and that's to refuse. Because look, as soon as data can be shared with me and be informed and it's understandable, and the GDPR, I think has made it very clear, much clearer when you can do it. Half of my discussions with authorities are about how we do this in a way that's
Interesting though as well, isn't it? But it does get kind of swallowed up under a gigantic vague term that means if it's fraud, do a war kind of. What I think is interesting though is that, and I think you said it in terms of, it's almost like you've got to, like my biggest issue with what we do is that no one wants to talk about it, because the implications of it being on the front page of the Daily Mail tomorrow or something like that is like, well, how do you know this telco sharing data with this bank, and everyone get panicky. And so I've been desperate for people to get in front of that and talk about the positive element of what's actually happening and how it's being done, how it's been done in the right way. I use the example of, use the identity, but the authorized push payment stuff. So we've developed things with the operators in the Netherlands, in the UK, and there's one or two other places now where you're fundamentally looking at what's going on behind the scenes associated to a high-risk payment. So it might be communications that's happening, it might be, I don't know, where the communication started from and ends up, and things like that. But instead of using that data to almost kind of go yes, no, where I find it fascinating is the using of that data to start hand-holding people to say, you're making a payment right now, do you know, so this will pop up in the app or whatever, do you know that if you think it's a bank, it's not? So please don't complete that. So instead of it just being like a transaction that gets stopped, it's it's almost like a guardian through a process. Oh no, there's loads of hands going on. It's not a good thing. But yeah, it's kind of using identity information to influence as opposed to just. That's it.
Yep.
Just click the button.
Maybe I can speak up. So to follow up on both your points, I'm going to ask a slightly provocative question, because I actually agree and disagree with both of you and do a little bit of work in a similar space. So on the point of transparency and people being asked whether or not they want their data shared, I guess my provocative question is, do you think those questions have any sort of, is there any actual meaning to them for the general public? So when they say it may help your credit score, the public doesn't really understand what the ramifications, positive or negative, of that might be. I do a lot of work using AI in the healthcare space. We're looking at a lot of electronic health records across the UK to look at multiple conditions. We've got a public involvement group, very actively, informatively involved in this. They're really keen, actually, on their data being shared and that positive message. But one of the reasons they're very keen is that we've given them a great deal of information and used that same sort of very granular and very concrete question asking, like, do you know this isn't a bank? right?
Yeah.
So I guess my provocative question is, are the data sharing requests meaningful? And if they aren't meaningful, how could we improve them? Because I think there's a great deal of goodwill amongst commercial and non-commercial enterprise to actually make it more transparent.
Oh, yeah, go, sorry.
Sorry, I'm Annika Alvarez Machia, and I do work with Oxford and Kent and NICE and things like that.
Can I stress that none of us want to do anything illegal? None of us want to upset customers. No, we don't. But the benefit of identity isn't just about crime prevention. It's about other things that can come with identity sharing. And I think the point behind your story is you've seen, by describing benefits in an open way, that other benefits can come through to those patients that receive those benefits. So it's upon us to explain the benefits, but it's not just about minimizing crime and maximizing advertising. GDPR stops us sharing data unless genuinely there has been opt-in for the customer to share the data. The mobile operators will only share data in the UK if it's agreed with those customers, and secondly, aggregated, and thirdly, totally anonymized. And an example of why they would do that is nothing to do with advertising. If you think about traffic congestion alerts or traffic information that could be relevant to a location, or if you think about environmental alerts to pollution, or if you think about by location, some other services that could be relevant to your health or your education, those sorts of benefits have got to come across very clearly. But I don't think any of us are pushing technology for its own sake, nor wishing to break the law.
Just got a couple of examples, because actually something you touched on there. We haven't scripted this, which is blindingly obvious with my rambling, so I apologise everybody in the room. But something that I was really keen to talk about. So I've got two critically vulnerable parents, and I witnessed firsthand them trying to navigate. It was actually, or it was authentication, or step authentication for payments. And I was like, I was sat there. So my father did it first. Now he has a mobile phone, so they were right, we're going to send you an OTP. And he sat there going, what the hell's an OTP? Now I talk about these things with him all the time. Completely clueless, doesn't understand where it fits. So anyway, he eventually got it sorted because they said to him, can you go and get a bank statement to verify it's you? They asked him a load of payments. He got through it. He picked the wrong bank statement. How he did it, I have no idea, but he got through it. Anyway, so he was there. Now he's got Parkinson's. It was triggering tremors, and it wasn't great. Now, my mother's had various things happen in recent times. She called the same bank. She doesn't have a mobile. So they said to her, right, now we're going to put you through and register your voice. And she said, so, voice is your password, you know, that kind of typical phrase. She broke down crying because she didn't even know why. Why they get the voice? The panic set in. And I was watching the pair of them thinking, this is ridiculous, because at no point has anybody gone, this is why we're doing it, or this is what it means, or this is how we're, no education, no nothing. It was just pushing them through a process. And then another example of, so I want to make it clear that, and I like when you get things like gambling companies enabling gambling and making it slick and everything, it's a little bit, you've always got this niggle that morally it's not quite the right thing. But there was a fascinating example of where leveraging open banking to determine ins and outs of bank accounts that's associated to gambling and your wages and all this kind of stuff, affordability, vulnerability, and it goes from there. That for me is a huge opportunity here, because like just understanding if somebody had an iPhone and suddenly they have a Nokia 6210, it's like, is that an indicator of somebody that's actually starting that vulnerability process, and maybe they're, you know, they've lost the job and things like that, but not doing it in a way that it's you can get this credit, you can't get this credit, but to the point where before the hand holding. It's like, well, actually, we can't give you this product, and but do it in a warm way and explain it and things like that. So anyway, it was just a kind of random thing.
Hi, my name is Rajesh. We run a fintech company. Basically, we provide security services to fintechs, basically banks and digital banks. And one of the threat for now, it's there for a few years now. SIM swapping, basically, where OTP is being shared. And this particular SIM swap used to happen through SS7 and diameter signaling hacking, which I also come from a telco background. So we do penetration testing, a lot of effort every time when a customer logs into their mobile banking app. We do SCAs and SDAs. And after that, we just check whether the SIM is swapped or not. And again, we do we help telcos to do a penetration testing on SS7 and diameter signals. Now we know the telco has been evaluated to 4G and 5G, which is basically NIoT, or it's a different technology, which is basically nothing but a digital network running on different cloud segments and stuff. So from a GSMA, what are the, what do you say, like, what are the future, how this will be stopped? Because most of the digital frauds, especially in banking, is happening, if you take even cryptocurrency thefts, all happening through this particular identity, especially on SS7 and the SITRAN hacking. So just want to understand from you, like, how.
Yeah, there's always these sort of frauds, and I guess whatever measures the operators put in place to stop the SIM swap fraud, you'll have insiders, you'll have people that will yeah. So there'll always be some instances of people managing to do a SIM swap. I guess what's been the game changer for me in the last few years is the fact that operators in most major markets have opened that data check via API. So it's really carefully controlled, but institutions can come and check whether a SIM swap has taken place. And I believe that you'd have much more data from the customers, but all the financial services that check that data with the operators, they don't get the fraud anymore.
Is not capturing the fraud. The biggest problem with SIM swap is the number of false positives. So
is it done on a signal, network level?
No. There's different ways of doing it, but not fundamentally. So it used to be. So what we do is we just basically get the number and the SIM, just basically look at the delta.
So
we now do it in a way that is based on, it's actually things like CRM systems, things like, it's where somebody's gone, I've registered a SIM with a particular number. It's like a layer above, but the false positive still remains a huge issue.
So one thing, other one is like anything not Apple is under, and there are a lot of hacked hardware devices, jailbreaking devices. The other problem with banks, because I help a lot of banks, the problem with banks is like these jailbreaking devices can be mirrored with a different device, and people can and there's no bank wants to provide their banking application to open it, and they check with them something called SDA, which is by Apple and Android person, and they use the GSM signals as well. So I have never seen a policy from a GSM in it, how to adopt hack phones or something like this. And now because we are in the eSIM era, where you can download the profiles or anything, or where are we heading about this?
GSMA has had a fraud and security group working for over 20 years, and that brings together specialists to minimize the threat to the customer, to the networks, to the applications. Some of the financial tech community deal with that group, and I would suggest that the sort of question you're raising should be discussed in that sort of arena, really. It's not we want to dismiss your question, that's the last thing we're doing. But I think there are some processes where these get to be a bit complicated, and it's quite important to have trust between the people who are discussing it, really. I'm not distrusting the audience, I'm just saying there's a mechanism that GSMA have got to do it.
But what I'd say is, it's very high level. But my experience of dealing with the banks and stuff from the other sectors of life, specifically around is that, for me, there's almost like a kind of 80-90% of everything is kind of captured by the mechanisms, the standards, and various other things that we've got in place. There'll always be edge cases. There's things that have been deployed in the UK recently where, again, there's subtle edge cases, but the critical thing is there's kind of two things. It's one of, if you think of it just pure fraud, well, I would argue that if there is a set of criteria or things or methods that are being adopted, or vectors or whatever, if you cover all this and there's something happening here, then at least you're pushing the fraud there that then allows other technology, other methods, other applications to sort that bit out. So there's that. But like if you look like the concept of what we do, we don't touch the mobile. Like everything's either network, CRM, the varying sources of where we get the information. And there'll always, like I said, there'll always be edge cases, but it's almost a case of as long as there's awareness of what they are or awareness of things and new methods and things that are coming in, it's like for me, most of the battle indication is mostly about, okay, we've determined this, what can we do? And then that collaborative element, which is kind of the third point which I didn't mention, but you look at some of the things that's happened recently, such as what you said, the banks, the telco, it's never been like this in terms of collaboration. Like I've been in the room and every bank and every telco has been represented in one place talking about specific challenges and actually coming up with answers. Not theories, not, oh, we did this could happen. It's like, well, actually, let's do studies. Let's work out based on data what affects what. So yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't answer the question, but what I'd say is that it's better than ever.
So my name is Prashant Patil. In banking and finance field. Suddenly it became a little bit technical, but I'll try to bring it back what Mike and probably Anurag referred to. What is digital identity? Because in banking industry, we look at it from mainly 3 different ways. It's like individual identity, platform identity, where platforms like Facebook, Amazon, those kind of platforms. And then we have the banks and government bodies, where you have shared identities, where you may or may not have the control over your identity. So in individual right, I can say, yeah, I'm not allowing anyone to share my data to anybody else. And then you have platforms like Facebook, you are allowing them to do certain things with it. So when it comes to the conflict between two organizations, whether it's fraud and investigatory bodies like police, investigatory things, could be anyone who is asking for any, when there is no approval given by the person. How do you see these differences? How do you manage those kind of conflicts between the in your BAU?
So I'm not going to answer the question, so I apologise, but it kind of triggered a few things. You mentioned kind of that kind of cross-sector, who owns what, and those other things. They always do. Like I always feel like there isn't a huge amount of focus on capturing the bad person who's doing the bad thing. It's typically more about my experience of all of what we're doing from an identity perspective. I look at it's the good, it's the positive, it's the how can we get as much through as possible that it should be getting through. And I use the example of I remember going into a fraud ops centre once and somebody called in and I got the opportunity to listen to the calls to see how they were handling it. And it would have been that scenario where it could have been a bank, it could have then moved to something else, somebody else's past data. It's a really complex kind of ecosystem. They made a decision based on the fact that her surname didn't match her accent. So, and I literally said from a technology standpoint, there was a thing in the corner with a green light, and a red light. So that cost the bank £20 million. Did you look at it now? So what made you, well, she didn't sound like she was from, I was like, well, okay, that's it, good feeling. And it's that, like, how can we get an understanding of identity? And this is why I love the mobile identity piece, by the way, in terms of it's the first opportunity we have digitally to kind of interact. So you get like average age of 11. So I've got 2 children, one's 11, one's 13, they've both got mobile. They're developing a presence already on platforms, etc. But with that, phone number has always been that kind of primary key. I'm not saying that's the answer to anything, but it's anything else. Sorry, I'm rambling.
I think if we take the sector of e-commerce, where the UK is a leader, per head identity management doesn't just come from the mobile, it also comes from the internet and the service being looked at. I think if we have a mobile-centric discussion, we won't get through all the while, but we also need to understand that identity comes from non-mobile sources as well. So the mobile internet actually brings together two major identifiers. So therefore, I don't want to compare mobile to the bank per se. I'd rather think about what's the range of identifiers that could be used for different purposes. That's why I bring in satellite, because actually that can do other things from an identification and a geography point of view. But I also would say that the banks have been served very well by the telecoms industry for a number of years. We may not even have the City of London in London were it not for telecoms and the history of telecoms. So actually, there's a good discussion. It's not always agreed as to what the solution is between the telcos and the banks, or the cost. It's not always agreed. However, at least that dialogue does take place. But I'm hesitating to go too deep into that dialogue in an open setting, because it's really one for the specialists, if I may put it that way.
Yeah. On the IoT or influences, basically devices, IoT and influences. So there are a lot of devices, IoT devices, basically which is certified or not certified, which is getting bigger and bigger every day. So what is the standard way of authenticating every time? One is onboarding and the other is authenticating at the real time. So basically, we know, right? Like there are devices which is issued and certified by certain, certified developers. I mean, the device manufacturers, and there are something which is non-certified. So everything is. Any device, pH meters or traffic signals or whatever it is. How does it mean? What is the framework on this? Just try.
I don't think you answer. I just want to make one comment on that, by the way, because everything we do is centered on. The company was called Secure Mobile. It's now Secure ID, but our concept was there's 7 whatever billion mobiles out there. The future direction for us is that there's 64 billion mobiles, SIMs connected and IoT devices and various other things, which opens up other methods of identity and then the operability and various other things. And if I'm honest, the CTO of Secure can articulate this infinitely better than I can. But if you think of it, it's almost like the security kind of paradigm or methodology is kind of there, using the passwords and things like that. But if you think of it, there's always like a default username and password, so it's an open goal in that sense. But quite often you'll get scenarios where, so you think about smart meters. Now using smart meter data, which you could in theory is acceptable, so we could tell somebody's at home. Okay.
Smart cities.
Right.
Let's take an example of that where it connects Olympic. Everybody comes here. I bring in a device, and I have a SIM card which is issued by some HLRs, and I am now authenticating on your network. Now, I have been into your network. So now that I'm into the network, I can do it. I can get into the system as well. Still, it is possible. But smart meters is a close IoT.
Sorry. It was more. It was more the theoretical idea of it's kind of it takes me back kind of 10 years to when you could access data, and if you're doing it the right way, etc., it was almost like let's turn a slight blind eye to it because we're doing fraud prevention, etc. If you look at what's happening now, where this whole IoT proliferation and everything's connected, and how wonderful the world is, the flip side is that now there's new data, there's new insights, there's new behaviors that people can determine. That you look at Ring doorbells that are just completely wide open, and it's like, well, you can determine if there's packages left on the doorstep, then okay, there's nobody at home. Or I know where people are coming and going from work and all this kind of stuff, and it's like everyone's just ignoring it because there's no it's identity security, however you want to kind of phrase it. For me, like it's a huge opportunity for all of us to see different ways of securing it. But I think you
react to. I think your two questions you asked, I feel there's a common theme, which is there's not going to be one source that's going to solve all of the problems. It's quite a complex problem with several layers. So you've talked about what can come from the networks, the mobile networks, or the SIM, and I think there we've got there's a history of security because it's been built in from the start, but then there's the device and all the vulnerabilities they may bring. And then you need to layer that together. And I think, I'm sure the banks, they look at several providers of solutions. They have to combine these to get that complete picture of, is that the right user? Or in the IoT world, can I trust this? And you need to trust all of the parts to trust the whole. I guess we're working on one part of it when we work with the mobile networks, and you need more than that to have a complete end-to-end security solution.
In banking, we do have a strong customer authentication, which is not just reliable messages, but we also have other authentication methods which we use. That makes a huge difference.
And that's when I referenced a couple of the table plans before.
Yeah.
Talk about personally being responsible for where we've leveraged the network to reduce the reliance on SSL. That was all done in a huge practice as well.
It has improved a lot because that has reduced quite a lot of fraud in the banking industry.
Well, it removes the human element, isn't it? Like the OTP for a start.
Yes.
There's no OTP to compromise as such.
Can I be a bit more positive to the question over here? The cellular side is standards based. The standards are moving, they have to move because they can't stand still. And from a cellular point of view, what we've built in is standards which can offer the best security but at a low cost. So there are some significant trade-offs here between the standardization approach and the cost issue. So when people talk about things, they want things as cheap as a tenth of a penny, if you like, as well as the higher end things that could be as high as £10,000. So it's really hard to deal with all these things with technology and standards. So there's a basket of that. The second thing is that most of the Internet of Things are not served by the network alone. They're often dealt with by specialist channels that are specialists in a given sector. And so they sometimes add value or do things differently from the way a network operator does. So it's quite important to understand the sector it's in and also the channel itself. And lastly, I think anything that's carrying data to and from a thing has some regulatory obligations anyway, whether it's a telecoms obligation or a connected thing obligation, such as protection and so on. There are some regulations that protect it. And I think you will find it's going to grow anyway, because actually people can see some major benefits in the Internet of Things through safety, productivity, sensing, measurement, all sorts of things there. So I wouldn't want anybody to leave with the impression that this is chaos. It's just there are many players in this space.
Just on that, by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that. So when I was in BT, Astrofarm, so the innovation centre, and leveraging connected devices to determine things like if somebody's fallen over, whether a chair has fallen over, and understanding whether it's a human or an object and things like that. Fascinating things, and even down to, and it sounds really basic, but it touches on some of the stuff we're talking with vulnerability, but the ability to connect almost communities. So it might be elderly, vulnerable, isolated, but having webcams switched on permanently in everybody's homes in an interconnected community just created just like vast waves of improvements in.
So I'm really interested in that, because I'm actually but there's a fair bit of modify their behavior so as not to intrude on tech, right? So you don't want to
Just not using that.
because it might trigger that you're unwell, so they felt that they had to constantly be moving, you know, whatever. And so, how is your fundamental to get aware of the impact? And this is all of the things surveillance, what it actually, I mean, I know surveillance is very long concept, but how do you balance the two to ensure that all that positive, again, without the at distance, you want it, or that the other two?
I think we all have that image. I mean, at GSM, we really see this as a positive vision that we're trying to improve society. But the reality, when you start to unpack things, it's not so simple. And I think sometimes I get a lot of reflection on the slow to. If you've got all this data, you could solve all this problem. You have to take it one at a time. I think the reason that things have started to get better is because the industry has focused on one problem at a time, solve it well, and realize what can you do that you've got a mandate to do. This is coming back to the point. If I'm trying to get people from fraud and I've thought about the edge cases and who could misuse that data, and have I got the right controls in place, and they're opening this in a very controlled manner. It's not everyone can come in and get my data and suddenly. For me, that step by step is how you solve it.
It's a bit like we mentioned the authentication thing before, and I said that friction, reducing the friction, you think is a positive, but actually it's not in most cases. So I go back to the kind of do thing. I think there's a progression, and that's really positive. I mean, but then I'm acutely aware as well that if I try and get my parents in any way, they regard it as being the burden. And I would imagine that's probably a general trend in terms of I don't want this here because of like there was almost two elements. There's like it's kind of the burdening of I'm okay, I'm stubborn, I know what I'm doing and everything's fine. But then the other element of intrusion. It's like, well, what are you doing and how does he do it? Which again comes back to the education piece. If I'm honest, I'm not an expert in kind of human behaviour clearly because the way I'm acting here. But
Can I say my specific answers to your question are, I think the mobile industry has been talking about inclusion for years and made sure that actually this is technology for all. It has to do some things to make it more suitable for some parts of society. How do we reduce the cost in some areas? How do we improve the geography in some areas or coverage in some areas? However, inclusion has been at the heart of this industry. And it's the biggest consumer electronics industry really on the planet, apart from perhaps computing some of stuff. Disability has been at the heart of the work of the GSM made in the last 20 years, if not more. How do we actually use techniques like text-to-speech, speech-to-text to make it easier and more comfortable for humans to actually communicate? There are discussion groups that are regularly occurring, perhaps not in the special corner of London that we're in tonight, but typically conferences and education sessions with different parts of society that have been supported by the industry for many years. Demonstrations. Why are there demonstrations? The reason you have demonstrations is so that people can understand what the tech is. Maybe the demonstrations need to be wider, but actually did them pretty well so far if you look at the adoption of mobile globally. And lastly, regulation. I think everybody's aware that sometimes people might see things differently. So why not think about some appropriate regulation in some areas to make sure it doesn't get out of hand as tech push as opposed to tech adoption, to make sure the inappropriate data sharing does not occur. So I think we've done lots of things. And there's always room to do more. And I think I welcome your question because I think it's something we should remind ourselves of. How can you do more of these sort of areas?
it's interesting that a couple of examples. Bank in the UK, huge bank, use phone call as a method of authentication. Now you'd think that just on a theoretical level, you think, well, actually that now gives us the opportunity to cover landline, mobile, maybe utility, etc. It was years after it was adopted that suddenly the idea that there's 80,000 customers of that bank who were hard of hearing, they couldn't get through it. But no one really thought about it. So then it was like, well, what do we do? Because we can't use voice. We need the ubiquity of, there's this method of, well, we can't. So lots of studies and tests, and I don't even know what they did in the end, but there was that. And then there was another one as well I was going to reference, and I can't remember now. But I think like, if I look at any deployments of any technology solution, shall we say, when you start the conversation around ubiquity and inclusivity and things like that, it's fascinating that if you try and think of everything up front, in my opinion, it doesn't go anywhere at all. So then you get nothing. There's no change because people go, well, actually, we've not got this anymore. So it's kind of like that, how do you eat a whale or elephant or whatever in one bite at a time. But I think what I would say is the awareness now of this vulnerable element. I actually think 80 people go, COVID triggered this, that, and the other. But I actually think COVID and the isolation it created suddenly made a lot of things that we thought were appropriate in terms of whether it's authentication, identity verification, various other things. It's like, well, people can't get to a branch anymore. And you didn't think about that, did you? And yet, my mum can't get to a branch anyway. She's got no mobile phone and she's got no internet. So what was she doing before COVID? It was only because COVID came along that suddenly it was, well, you're going to have to drag yourself to a branch. You have one leg. I can take it to, but you know, I don't know. It's just that, I don't know. There's that kind of, you try and think of everything, you don't. But I like the idea that at least we're having the conversation.
You have to look at maybe if you start thinking boxing every element, you not reach anywhere. You will actually end up doing injustice to the masses in terms of the purpose for which you are trying to build. Can't agree more.
Is it like I'm going to get this analogy wrong, but like we need faster horses as opposed to cars kind of thing. It's like we'll never make the transition because people are just, yeah. I mean, I think there's huge amounts we can do, but I think when you're on the right side of some of what's happening in the tests and trials, and I always use the term that my favourite innovation is innovating on what's there already. Like you look at kind of there's elements of communities in Africa that are leveraging parts of networks that have been used before for payments, things like that. And I think it was Andy Sinclair, the Jason that mentioned this. And it's like, well, somebody came up with the concept of, well, let's use this part of the spectrum, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly you had all this payment activity going on. And it was shafts made of like corrugated iron. It's amazing because you're leveraging
How you could summarize the entire personal user system industry to the source tool, and I think actually as a case study that telecom in terms of when mobile technology started it was only a few people that could afford it, and it has changed every other person has a mobile phone right now, maybe two for that. So thank you for that. And I particularly love how we touch different topics today, starting from what identity is, what identifiers would be, who is paying for the identity. I want to talk about the newer things that are happening in the industry, particularly around decentralized identity or user-centric reusable identity. What are you seeing in the industry? What are the different ideas you're tinkering with? Has it opened any new opportunity with any models or business model per se? And then, if you could sum it up with respect to regenerative AI, is it impacting what the existing work that we're doing?
Could you introduce yourselves? Sure.
Oh, yes, I'm Priya Duyani, I'm the CEO at we're a decentralized identity platform.
So really nice to hear about that. I was keen to hear from the audience in the panel today, but on decentralized identity, I feel like for a long time it was this ideology, yes, the user in charge of that data, obviously we all love this, but in practice, how does this look like? And who's the first one to adopt it to get the adoption, and how to explain it to people? I'm really fascinated by what's happening in Europe. There's definitely a clear ambition to have technology and make it mainstream by 2030, 80% of people should have an identity wallet. This is not that far off. I don't know what the predictions would be of success of this, and will it be mainstream, or will it remain that solution I only use to, fill in my tax return, or that's really where it's going to be make or break. And we're looking at it quite closely because obviously as mobile operators can benefit from it, we need to identify people. Of course, if they come with their identity, it's been verified, it's been issued by government, and it's great, simplifies everyone's life, and we can help with the solution, make it more efficient, make it bring some elements, because I guess that while it will be a collection of attributes that come from a lot of people. So it'll be me, and I've got this diploma, and I've got this verified mobile number, which my operators will have place to verify, and you have all these elements together. So we're looking at the debate really closely to see how we bring our brick to the solution. But I still have a real question in my head about adoption. Will people understand what's being done? Will it be secure? Will it really preserve my privacy? Will I not think that government's going to track everything I do with this wallet because they've issued it in the first place. I think there's a lot of questions to resolve.
So I think the security needs to match the application, whether it's decentralized or not. We need to be quite clear on that. And it's not always going to be done from telecoms networks. Sometimes it might be done from other sources. So a couple of examples from satellite, if I may just refer to that. One of the biggest decentralized data sets is the Earth itself and how we look at the Earth. So we've done some work at the Satellite Applications Catapult with a company called GHGSat that specialize in looking at gases, particularly methane gases from above. And by using that, we've got data sets from them which enable us to look at where there are methane emissions that can be seen around our island called the UK. By taking some of those data sets and working with key research and university partners, we found that there are some methane leaks that need to be dealt with. So in some ways you could say it's a federated data set and people are applying great mindsets to help protect our planet. Same logic can be used in other countries. It's not just particularly in the UK. It depends on the accuracy of the satellite, the interpretation of the data, and looking at. And we found some major methane leaks over Cardiff that are now being dealt with, and that was on BBC News 2 weeks ago. We've also been doing some work with companies looking at plastics in the ocean. And again, it's a federated geographic data set where Earth observation from those satellites really helps. You've got to identify the location with some precision. You've got to also look at the flow of plastics in the oceans because they might move, but actually putting a lot of brilliant people on that sort of thing may help to protect our oceans. And if we can do it for plastics and for methane, we can do it for lots of other things. The identity, though, is a different issue. It's about location identity or location intelligence and then making sure you've got the right people on it. So I think we'll see new solutions which look at location intelligence in different ways without it impinging on individuals who may be worried about it, or perhaps some sectors who would worry about it. But we need to push the envelope further to see how can we analyze these issues to save our planet. Simple as that. I don't know what Earth ID is doing. I'd love to talk about that more.
Can I just say there's a couple of things you mentioned there. So I think the key one on the first topic is interoperability and the ability to, one size fits all. But on the second one, and again, articulate people, but using a kind of practical example, we've had a situation recently where leveraging AI, etc., and synthetic identity, and then leveraging that then to try and onboard for different products and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of fascinating that even in that instance, so we did a trial.
She's in Barcelona. She's a person.
Phones, like really basic, anonymized. About 10% of them that had gone through this process of this, this synthetic identity was based on this AI. About 10% of them weren't associated to an operator. They were just, it was a set of numbers to the naked eye, and everything else would tick. So it's kind of, they've got all this kind of really fancy, progressive technology stuff that's going on over here, and it's kind of fascinating that actually to solve the problem, it just came down to that was outside of a number range or something like that. But, yeah, well, I mean, I always go back into the kind of empirical, just doing stuff, and I'm like, oh, well, actually, that's really basic, isn't it? But we are seeing an impact there.
Okay, we've got a question from Barcelona. So,
hi everyone, good evening. From Voice from Now at the GSM as well, connecting here from Barcelona. I hope you can hear me okay. So first of all, thank you Sebastian and Tech Tuesday UK for including us, and hi to my colleague Helen. I wanted to maybe hear your views a little bit about the business aspect, specifically from the point of view of startups and small to medium enterprises who are facing barriers to entry in terms of applying some of these digital identity related technologies. Some of their business viability is obviously dependent on that. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that's been done currently to make sure that those actors can actually operate in sort of the different fields that are affected by digital identity and what we can do maybe in the future to make sure that those barriers do not, prevent them from innovating, bringing value, successful businesses.
So you know, I chair the UK Telecoms Innovation Network Advisory Board. Within the UK TIN has over 5,000 members. So bringing people together to discuss buy-side, supply-side issues is a natural first step. Secondly, I think DCIT, the UK government's Department for Science and Innovation and Technology, have a big fund for demonstrators. Some of that is applicable to security as much as pure telecoms, 5G or even 6G. So demonstrator programs are really useful to exchange knowledge. I think in addition to that, we have certain innovation activities that are useful within UK TIN. So working groups on security and standards, but also on some of the issues that people want to address. So how can IoT develop? How can M2M develop? Clearly, what we don't want to do is to stand in the way of innovation. We want to help it along. But the fact is that the UK government does support innovation in a big way, having highlighted telecoms, future comms, if you like, areas like semiconductors as important areas. So there is lots of funding from central government to support them. I would also say the UK rejoining Horizon Europe is a good sign. Better collaboration on an international basis has to be the way forward. But I think if we put all those together, there's a lot of support. Clearly, the UK has typically been a strong supporter of the mobile industry. 155 UK companies went to Mobile World Congress in February. That's a sign of a growing desire to collaborate internationally. But we've clearly got to find the market. Now, I think with any innovator, they need to know who is their customer. And sometimes the big problem starts there. They don't know who is the customer. But if you're in bigger networks, you get a better chance of finding them. If you're in bigger networks, you may find the money that's available from government. But you've got to talk about it within the right networks that suit your field. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, do a really good job of answering the question here. But one of the biggest challenges that I see is if we talk about identity, digital mobile identity, if you're looking to work with whoever it is, whether it be a major organisation or SME, etc., we're still in a situation where nobody actually knows it. So when it comes to things like innovation, when it comes to things like future direction in terms of kind of working together and collaboration, etc., the biggest barrier is actually, I completely agree with you in terms of the government's there, in terms of the UK supporting, and it supports us as well with various activities. But when you start delving into that commercial world of, okay, where can we look at maybe kind of, I don't know, working with a brand or a multitude of different brands, or where there's maybe a lack of economies of scale where you're trying to, it still feels very embryonic. So it's almost like one thing I always say is there's still a tendency globally to try and kind of like one size fits all, we'll cookie cut the same solution in every country, we'll ignore regulation and all the rest of it. Nobody starts by going, what is the problem? What are we trying to solve? And then from that point forward, it's, I don't know, I mean, Notice Gotham, who's the CTO of Security up here on the screen, but like our biggest barrier to entry is actually, it's not demand, it's probably more supply, but we're in the fortunate position that we have the likes of Gotham who actually define the standards that we're adopting. So it's kind of difficult for me to kind of comment in terms of barriers, but yeah, I don't know, it's more of kind of like, if I was going to start today and you said, right, we want to talk identity with 10 banks in the UK, we did a study recently, I think it was 19 people had identity in their job title across the whole of the UK banking ecosystem. It's that, for me, is the bigger barrier. It's kind of like, well, actually, everything's very siloed still. Everything's very, I'll solve that problem, and then they throw it over a fence. Let somebody else solve the next problem.
I would like to come back to the question Mike put to us at the start. Who's going to pay for that identity? Ultimately, no business isn't there to check your identity. They're there to offer you a different service, and that's the problems we face. And I think that's why people come at it from different angles. There's this initiatives from governments and others trying to put an identity in your hand, saying, well, without that, you can't do anything, so you can't access digital services. We need to give you that. It's kind of a fundamental to bring that digital inclusion. There's other initiatives like what we're doing, where we're saying, well, it can be quite cumbersome to prove your identity, but there's other things you can get from the mobile networks. They may not give you the complete picture, but they'll help some elements and lower the barrier to adoption for these businesses that may not put in place a super complex solution, may not have the whole IT department. But fundamentally, we always come back to the internet was built without that identity layer, and we're forever trying to fix that problem. Good, I'm sure you've got great thoughts on this. I don't know why Gautam is this way, that way.
Yeah, look this way.
Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Live already, yeah.
I can hear you on my side.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, you are. Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Yeah, so no one can hear me. It looks like, I don't know if this
Yeah, we all can hear you, Gautam. Go ahead. Well, he can see us, of course.
I just wanted to share, few things. We were talking about identity, inclusion, and thanks, Helen, for raising the issue of the missing identity layer. So let's just face it, right? So the internet was not designed to identify the human user. It was designed to identify the computers. That's why there are IP addresses. Fortunately or unfortunately, these humans don't have IP addresses. And that's why we started to create stopgap measures, starting with user ID passwords, which pre-existed the internet, as we call it, or the web. Then we added SMS OTP, we talked about that. Then we have biometrics. So they are all stopgap measures, right? Because internet still doesn't have that identity there. So internet has an identity crisis. We were talking about inclusion and we were talking about how the mobile operators can participate. We almost forget that the I in the SIM stands for identity. It's subscriber's identity module. It was standing for identity in 1991, where the first thing was used from GND. It still stands for identity when SIMs are used, right? So if we can just see very basic way, how do we get identified in the normal internet? If I want to access my Barclays Bank will not trust that this is me. They will challenge me, and then I have to prove that this is me using whatever it is, using SMS OTP, using biometrics. But when we need to, when we see how the mobile operators identify, it works in a very different way. If you can assume that the mobile network, the equivalent of the internet, for the mobile operator, it works very differently. When I need to make a phone call, when I need to receive a phone call, when I need to send an SMS, when I need to receive an SMS, or when I need to set up any data connection, the mobile operators don't challenge me. It works completely differently. They just identify me, invisibly through that SIM. So why can't we actually bridge the mobile operators' internet enabled by the SIM? And again, I in the SIM stand for identity. To solve the identity crisis of the internet, instead of the stopgap solutions, we create the identity layer for the internet. That's basically what the industry and society should be using. And on the inclusion side, the SIM is probably one of the most inclusive technologies, because it doesn't matter whether it's a high-end iPhone 15 Pro or it's a very economic, $50 or even $10 Android phone. The SIM is exactly the same. The SIM is protecting the user behind that $5, $10 Android phone and identifying the exactly same way as the user behind that iPhone 15 Pro. So that way, SIM is one of the most inclusive technology that we have to solve that identity problem. Why don't we use that to solve the identity? That's the problem.
Thanks, Gautam. Any questions?
Good. That probably brings us to the end of the session today. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, due to the ongoing situation, we said want to wrap up as soon as possible. People have to travel to various parts of London and outside London as well. First of all, thanks to Mike, Ellen, and Kim for making it. Thanks for sharing knowledge. Thanks for spending some time. Thank you each one of you. As I mentioned earlier, while we wrap the session, we already said in the beginning, we probably request all of you to say that enjoy the brains as well as you two wonderful volunteers out here in the show. On them with Lena, you will be coordinating sort of interactions next video and take some video rights of yours. Before I wrap up, very quick information. The next episode of Tech Tuesday is happening on the 7th of November. This will be on Gen I. So if you're interested, if you have your friends, family, enemies, foes, please ask them. This will be followed by the session every single month of December. We will be as of the 5th of December. We will have esports and gaming as a topic. In the month of January, so the 9th of January, second week for a change, because first week of January, I don't think anybody is keen to take so much knowledge in one shot. So 9th of January, we will have Web3 as a topic. So yeah, that's all from my side. Thanks to each one of you once again for making it today. Enjoy the games, great rest of the evening. Thank you.